will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation. Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg?
Joseph Goebbels was much more than Hitler's propaganda minister. Behind his public image existed a man full of obsessions, secrets, and contradictions. Very few know that before entering Nazism, he dreamed of becoming a writer and novelist, but his works were constantly rejected, feeding a resentment that would mark his life. Before radicalizing, he even came to sympathize with revolutionary and socialist ideas, something he later tried to erase from his past. He was one of the first politicians to understand the psychological power of cinema, radio, and mass manipulation, convinced that a lie repeated enough times could transform into truth. However, while promising victory to the German people, in his private diaries he already recognized that the Third Reich was doomed, and even knowing that everything had ended, he chose to remain in the Führerbunker alongside Hitler until the end. 25 facts, 25 fractures in the glass. Reich, Rhineland, October 29, 1897. A manufacturing city of about 45,000 inhabitants, attached to the flank of Mönchengladbach, 25 kilometers west of Düsseldorf and 35 kilometers east of the Dutch border. There, in a terraced house on Dahlemer Strasse, within the exact cold of Rhineland winters, Paul Joseph Goebbels was born. Third son of Friedrich, nicknamed Fritz, an office clerk in a small company, and Katharina, described by early biographers as a simple woman with little formal education. The family was devoutly Catholic. Every pfennig was counted. The walls of the house in winter smelled of humidity and coal. But there was something the Goebbels wanted more than bread, social advancement, and they projected that advancement onto the third son from the first moment it became clear he was different. Because little Joseph had a deformed right foot, an infantile paralysis that was not operated on until 1907, when he was 9 years old. The operation failed. From then on, he walked with a perceptible limp for his entire life. In a Germany permeated with Prussian military values, where a robust body and military service were markers of masculine honor, this was a permanent scar, visible in every step. What neighbors would remember later, when the child was already the most feared man in the Reich, was the day the Goebbels bought a piano. They had saved for months, perhaps years. The piano was installed in the parlor, the room that normally remained locked, reserved only for solemn occasions. From that day, little Joseph had daily access to that room. According to his own memory, in the winter months he practiced in a coat, hat, and scarf, reading the sheet music only when the moonlight was sufficient to illuminate the pages. This image, which Goebbels himself preserved and repeated, reveals something. He was not the child that others silently victimized. He was the child who created narratives of himself, who turned deprivation into epic. The cold parlor, the moonlit sheet music, the discipline over the keys, all of it sounded like destiny in his imagination. And years later, that same ability to turn the sordid into the sublime would be the most dangerous weapon of the Third Reich. Goebbels himself wrote in 1924 in an autobiographical text that after the operation his childhood became quite somber. He could no longer join the games of other children. He became, in his words, a loner, a stepwolf. That word Steppenwolf, which Hermann Hesse would also use in his 1927 novel, was not accidental. Goebbels saw himself as a creature between two worlds, too intelligent for bourgeois mediocrity, too deformed for the heroic glory that the era demanded. And that tension was never resolved. It only radicalized. When World War I broke out in August 1914, the collective heat of patriotism that swept Germany also affected the house on Dahlemer Strasse. Goebbels' two older brothers, Konrad and Hans, marched to the Western Front. Joseph tried to enlist. He was rejected immediately due to his disability. According to his first biographers, who collected testimonies from those who knew him at that time, Goebbels withdrew to his room for several days, unable to bear the rejection and humiliation. It is difficult to verify this with exactness, but what we do know, through his own later writings, is the long-term effect. The war experience that his generation called Fronterlebnis, the fellowship forged in the trenches, the camaraderie under fire, was something he would never have, and that absence would haunt him. Years later, when he was already Gauleiter of Berlin and then minister, Goebbels would have to interact with hundreds of war veterans within the Nazi Party, men who shared a founding experience from which he was excluded by physical constitution. His brother Hans was captured by the French in 1916. He would not return to Reich for 5 years. That same year, the younger sister Elizabeth died of tuberculosis at 12 years old. The Goebbels house, already austere, was tinged with accumulated mourning. The young Joseph, alone, with the weight of his parents' dreams upon him, began to build his own world in books. He read with an almost compulsive voracity Goethe, Dostoevsky, Hesse, Strindberg, Tolstoy, Cervantes. He developed a tortured and grandiloquent literary voice. He wrote poems, dramas, short stories. His earliest known poem from the year 1912, when he was 15 years old, was about the dead friend who departs too soon, leaving the author alone and without hope. The lyricism of death and abandonment as central themes at age 15. In 1917, about to leave the gymnasium, he was chosen to deliver the valedictory speech of his class. He spoke of that great Germany at which the entire world looks with fear and admiration. The style was already there. Grandiloquence, direct emotional appeal, manipulation of collective sentiment. All of it at 19 years old, before his classmates. That same summer he enrolled in the University of Bonn. Between 1917 and 1921, Goebbels studied in Bonn, Freiburg, Würzburg, Munich and Heidelberg. A university journey financed largely by loans from a Catholic charitable society because his family could not afford his upkeep away from home. He studied history, literature, philology, art. His doctoral dissertation, defended in Heidelberg in 1921, analyzed the work of Wilhelm von Schütz, a minor 19th-century German writer practically unknown. The work was accepted, Dr. Goebbels. That title he would use with ostentation for the rest of his life. What his formal studies did not teach Goebbels, or rather what his formal studies could not do against the readings he imposed on himself, was the capacity to doubt himself. In Freiburg, he met Anke Stahlhelm, a student from a wealthy family in Recklinghausen. He fell in love with the intensity he put into everything. In the summer of 1920, while both were studying in Heidelberg, she left him for another man, Georg Mumme. When Goebbels tried to win her back, Anke and Mumme hired a lawyer to ask him to desist and to return gifts and letters. Goebbels fell into a desperation that he himself described as suicidal. Years later, in 1928, he wrote in his diary, "A person has one great love in life. Everything else is illusion or adventure. Mine is named Anke." But there was another woman, Else Janke, a schoolteacher in Reich, kind, intelligent, who had known the Goebbels family for a long time. In 1922, they began an intimate relationship, and then, in 1923, Goebbels discovered that Elsa's mother was Jewish. What followed is revealing. In his diaries, with a coldness that chills, Goebbels began to analyze Elsa through the racial prism. On October 22, 1923, he wrote, "He also cannot deny her Jewish blood. There is something strikingly destructive in her character." And then, in the same entry, "How to love both, how to hate both." Anke was racially pure. Elsa was a transgression that he could not entirely abandon because he loved her, and that tormented him. What this episode demonstrates is not that Goebbels was a simpleton hypocrite, but something darker. His anti-Semitism was not just borrowed political ideology. It was an intimate, personal obsession rooted in simultaneous rage and desire. In the logic of blood that he himself had constructed, loving Elsa was a racial betrayal. And that internal tension, that horror toward himself, would be channeled throughout the following decades outward, with catastrophic results for millions. In 1923, after finishing his doctorate and failing to publish any of his literary works, Goebbels had to surrender to the most brutal reality. Without money, he returned to the family home in Reich. For several months, he worked as a clerk at the Dresdner Bank in Cologne, alternating the daily commute with brief stays in rented rooms. He did bookkeeping and occasional tutoring to earn a few additional marks. He was a man in his 20s, trapped in his parents' house, without stable employment, without publishing prospects, with fractured romantic relationships, and a Germany collapsing in hyperinflation. The notebook that Elsa Janke gave him so he could write down his thoughts cost her at October 1923 prices the fantastic sum of 1 billion marks. That was what an empty notebook was worth at the peak of German hyperinflation. On October 17, 1923, Goebbels wrote his first entry in that diary, and he did not stop until April 10, 1945, less than 3 weeks before his death. 22 years of almost daily writing. 33 volumes in the final critical edition published by the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich. Some entries dictated to stenographers in the final years of war when the time to write by hand had run out. Goebbels' diary is one of the most vast, most intimate, and most disturbing historical documents of the 20th century. In his first entries, he wrote about Elsa, about Dostoevsky, about Bach played on an organ in Mönchengladbach, about the political chaos that surrounded him, but also about the Jews. The third entry of the diary already mentions them explicitly. Goebbels reflects on the problem of race, distinguishes between creativity and reproduction, between art and science, between industrial capitalism and stock market capitalism. For him, all that conceptual architecture was one single thing: Germans versus Jews, race and destiny. What makes this document so valuable for historians is precisely its frankness. It was not written for immediate publication. Goebbels did not know in 1923 that he would become one of the most powerful and feared men in Europe. He wrote for himself with an honesty that in the following years was used to reveal the most direct connections between him and the decisions of extermination. He was never as careful in his diaries as he was in his public speeches. And that, for those of us who came later, is a horrible gift. Between 1919 and 1924, Goebbels wrote 3 plays that were rejected by every theatre to which he sent them. He wrote an autobiographical novel titled Michael Fuhrmann, Die Schicksal eines Menschen in Tagebuchblättern, which he revised several times and sent to at least 4 different publishers. All of them rejected it. He wrote poems that were not published. Short articles for local right newspapers that barely left a mark. This accumulated literary failure is not a minor detail. It is possibly the most important key to understanding Goebbels' radicalization. He had a genuine talent for writing. His serious biographers, including historian Toby Thacker from Cardiff University, recognize that he was a competent writer, even notable in his best moments. His prose had rhythm, force, a capacity to appeal directly to the reader's emotions. But his literary works went in a direction that publishers in 1920s Germany did not want. A Völkisch mysticism loaded with grandiloquence, mixed with an anti-Semitism that permeated everything, wrapped in philosophical references that did not always articulate with coherence. When in 1925 the Nazi Party publishing house Franz Eher finally published the definitive version of Michael, Ein deutsches Schicksal in Tagebuchblättern, with some modifications compared to previous versions, Goebbels had already found a different channel for his creative energy: politics. And within politics, propaganda. There, where literary publishers had rejected him, the crowds responded. The metaphors that did not serve on paper worked on the microphone. Michael would be the only published novel by Goebbels. It sold modestly. But by 1929, when the Nazi Party began to grow with force, it already circulated as a formative text within internal circles. The protagonist, Michael Vormann, was a wounded war veteran who abandons university studies to work as a miner among the people, where he finds a new sense of belonging and dies in an accident in a heroic manner, a combination of his dead friend, Richard Fliskers, and himself. Worker Christ redeemed by blood. That would be the aesthetic of all his subsequent propaganda. A central irony in Goebbels' history is this: he joined the Nazi Party late, and the party did not receive him with enthusiasm. He had no contact with the Nazi movement during the years of its formation in Munich in 1920 and 1921, when the party already existed. He did not participate in the Munich Putsch of November 8th to 9th, 1923. He only read about Hitler in the reports of the high treason trial held in Munich between February 26th and March 27th, 1924, when the accused was authorized to give long speeches that were widely reproduced in the German press. On March 13th, 1924, Goebbels noted in his diary for the first time that he was occupying himself with Hitler and the National Socialist movement. Socialism and Christ, he wrote, an ethical foundation. In the following days, he followed his comments on the trial with increasing fascination. On March 20th, he wrote, "Hitler is an idealist with enthusiasm, a man who brings new faith to the German people. I read his speeches, I let myself be inspired by him and elevated to the stars." But he still took time to act. On April 5th, 1924, together with his school friend Fritz Prang, he founded in Reich a National Socialist regional group. It was small, peripheral, practically invisible from Munich. And when the party was banned after the putsch and Hitler was imprisoned, the small organization fell into a nebula of competing right-wing nationalist groups. It was only in November 1924 when Goebbels began to work for Gregor Strasser in the regional organization of the party in the Rhineland-Ruhr area, traveling to dozens of cities to deliver speeches. And here, what would change everything occurred. The crowds responded. Something in the way Goebbels spoke, the resonant voice, the calculated gestures, the rhythm that alternated short phrases with long periods, the ability to turn collective resentment into an almost religious experience, worked in a way that no other speaker of the same stature had been able to achieve. Goebbels himself noted in his diary on May 3, 1924, after his first political speech, "I spoke freely for the first time. Good success." It was the beginning of everything. Between 1925 and 1926, Goebbels was on Gregor Strasser's side in the most important internal conflict of the Nazi Party before the seizure of power. Strasser represented a more socialist wing of the party, more willing to seek alliances with labor unions and the radical left, and more skeptical regarding Hitler's personal authoritarianism. Goebbels did not just not oppose these positions in several aspects, he shared them actively. In February 1926, at the Bamberg conference called by Hitler to resolve the party's internal disputes, Goebbels remained on the losing side. Hitler crushed Strasser's positions and made it clear that he was the only axis of the organization. Goebbels suffered. He wrote in his diary that he felt a sorrow of the soul, that Hitler was everything opposite to what he had thought, that he was a reactionary, that he had confused social justice with Marxist materialism, and then Hitler invited him to speak. On April 8, 1926, Goebbels delivered a speech in Munich before a carefully selected audience. Hitler listened to him, and then he spoke to him in private for hours. What occurred in those conversations is difficult to reconstruct with precision, but the effect was dramatic. A few days later, Goebbels was writing in his diary, "Who is this man, half plebeian, half God, Christ, or only John the Baptist?" The surrender had begun. Goebbels never again fundamentally doubted Hitler. The relationship that was forged in those months of 1926, and that would be consolidated when Hitler named him Gauleiter of Berlin in November of that year, was not simply that of subordinate to boss. It was something more disturbing, an almost religious delivery. Hitler was for Goebbels the externalization of his own impulses, the man who had found action where he had only found words, the leader who transformed resentment into power. In his diaries throughout the following 20 years, there are more than 100 moments in which Goebbels uses the language of religious devotion to describe his relationship with Hitler. When the cause would be lost beyond all doubt and the bunker sank under Soviet bombs, that relationship would define the most terrible decision of his life. In November 1926, Hitler sent Goebbels to Berlin with an almost impossible mission: to conquer for the Nazi Party a deeply hostile city with a rooted socialist and communist tradition, governed largely by the Social Democratic Party and with a strong communist presence in its working-class districts. The Nazi Party in Berlin had at that moment barely a few hundred members. Its presence was marginal, almost comical. Goebbels was not an organizer. He was an agitator, and agitating was what he did best. The first thing he did was to understand how enemy propaganda worked. The communist newspaper Die Rote Fahne, the Red Flag, was his direct competition. Violent in its language, direct, pointing to working-class identity, full of cartoons and calls to action. Goebbels created Der Angriff, the attack, which appeared for the first time on July 4, 1927, with an initial circulation of barely 2,000 copies. But from the first issue it was different. Combative, personal, aggressive, with the first-person style that Goebbels had developed in his diary and in his articles. The first issue had on its cover a caricature of the Jewish banker Jakob Goldschmidt, drawn by Hans Schweitzer under the pseudonym Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. Goebbels' editorial declared, "Germany is an exploitation colony of international Jewish financial capital." The formula worked. By October 1929, the newspaper came out twice a week, after November 1930, daily. It became the Nazi newspaper with the highest circulation in northern Germany. But Der Angriff was much more than a newspaper. It was a machine for converting ordinary citizens into fanatics. Goebbels understood decades ahead of modern communication theory that the audience needed to feel that it was itself the hero of the story, that its enemies were concrete and named, that the struggle had its own victims and martyrs. He created in its pages a mythology of the Berlin movement, with the SA men as urban warriors, with the Jews as a tangible threat on every corner, with the Republican establishment as an identifiable conspiracy. One of his most sophisticated creations was the figure of Isidor, a nickname he invented for the deputy chief of the Berlin police, Bernhard Weiss, a Jew and decorated war veteran. For years, Der Angriff presented him as the stereotype of the corrupt Jewish bureaucrat, mocking his appearance, his name, his origin. Weiss sued Goebbels in court on multiple occasions. Goebbels lost some cases, paid fines, and continued. He even went as far as publishing 2 entire books of jokes and cartoons about Weiss. This was not just political cruelty, it was a laboratory of techniques that later would be applied on an industrial scale. In November 1930, one afternoon in his office, Goebbels noted briefly that a beautiful woman named Quandt was organizing his personal archive. It was Magda Ritschl, divorced from the industrialist Günther Quandt, from whom she had obtained a generous pension and a flat on the Reichskanzlerplatz in the heart of Berlin. She had a 9-year-old son from that marriage, Harold, and she was, by all available accounts, a person of sharp intelligence, iron will, and notable beauty. In a few weeks, Goebbels was in love. His diary entries became filled with references to the beautiful Magda, to nights that ended at 6 in the morning in conversation, to the feeling of peace and fulfillment she gave him. By February 1931, he already spoke of love explicitly. In May of that year, they went together for the first time to the countryside, to the Quandt family estate in Severin, Mecklenburg. It was there they made the decision to marry, although they postponed the announcement until the party took power. But the triangle that this relationship formed was much more complicated. Hitler was also in love with Magda. Goebbels knew it. He recorded it in his diary with a mixture of anguish and pride. On September 1st, 1931, while Goebbels was in Hamburg for a speech, Hitler invited Magda to eat alone. "The rogue," Goebbels wrote, "I am truly sad." On September 12th, there was a confrontation. In the text of the diary from that date, there are 3 lines physically cut and replaced by clean paper, which suggests that someone, possibly Goebbels himself or his collaborators, considered what was written there too compromising to preserve. What does survive is the entry from September 16th, 1931. Hitler took Goebbels aside after a meeting of party leaders in Munich and spoke to him with warmth. He told him that he loved Magda, but that he was not envious of his happiness. An intelligent and beautiful woman. She will not slow you down, she will support you. And then, according to Goebbels, he takes both hands and tears come to his eyes. "My best wishes. I am very grateful. He says many good things about me. My brave comrade and Führer. We will marry immediately. He is somewhat resigned. Fortune has not smiled on him. Poor dear Hitler." A few weeks later, Hitler's niece, Geli Raubal, was found dead in her apartment in Munich. The circumstances of her death remain obscure. Biographer Toby Thacker points out that Hitler's infatuation with Magda could have been a factor in Geli Raubal's already fragile relationship with her uncle. Goebbels and Magda married on December 19, 1931. Hitler was the witness of honor. The union produced 6 children, all whose names started with H. Helga, 1932, Hildegard called Hilda, 1934, Helmut, 1935, Holdine called Holder, 1937, Hedwig called Hedda, 1938, and Haida, 1940. And all died in that bunker on the night of May 1st, 1945. On March 13th, 1933, 6 weeks after Hitler was named Chancellor, Goebbels was designated Reichsminister für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda, Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. He was 35 years old. It was, alongside Hitler's chancellery, the position of greatest influence over the mental and cultural life of Germany. The first thing he did was to create the Reich Chamber of Culture, an organization that divided all German cultural life into 7 chambers: press, radio, cinema, theater, music, fine arts, and literature. To practice any profession in any of these areas, it was mandatory to belong to the corresponding chamber. And to belong to the corresponding chamber, you could not be Jewish. With that mechanism, Goebbels achieved in a surprisingly short period what no brutal and bureaucratic censor would have achieved: the racial purification of German cultural life without the need for direct prohibitions, simply by denying the professional license. Jewish musicians were not expelled en masse on the first day. Their contracts simply were not renewed. Their names disappeared from programs. Their works stopped being performed. By February 1937, Goebbels noted in his diary with evident satisfaction, "The Reich Chamber of Culture now completely purged of Jews. A grandiose achievement of which I am proud." The Ministry of Propaganda also controlled the radio, which Goebbels had understood from the beginning was the most powerful medium to reach millions of homes simultaneously. When the party came to power in 1933, there were about 4 million registered radio receivers in Germany. By 1939, there were more than 16 million. Goebbels pushed the production of the Volksempfänger, the People's Receiver, a simple and cheap device that was mass-produced to guarantee that almost any German home could receive the state signal. The ministry held daily ministerial meetings at 11 in the morning, where Goebbels personally dictated the editorial lines that all newspapers and radio stations in the Reich had to follow. Not as suggestions, as orders. Editors who did not follow them risked their career, their freedom, or worse. On May 10, 1933, in Berlin's Openplatz, the current Bebelplatz students from the National Socialist Students' League, acting under the auspices of the Ministry of Propaganda, lit a pyre with tens of thousands of books. Books by Heinrich Heine, by Karl Marx, by Sigmund Freud, by Magnus Hirschfeld, by Erich Maria Remarque, whose anti-war novel All Quiet on the Western Front Goebbels had already sabotaged in December 1930 by organizing a gang of agitators who threw mice and tear gas bombs at the Berlin premiere until getting the film withdrawn from theaters. The book burning of May 1933 was repeated that same night in more than 20 German university cities. Goebbels spoke before the bonfire in Berlin. His speech was broadcast by radio. He declared that the era of exaggerated Jewish intellectualism had ended, that from the flames a new spirit arose, that the past would be reduced to ashes. What he did not say, what no contemporary analysis thought to point out with sufficient emphasis, was the following: the man who ordered the burning of books was the same one who for years had desperately tried to publish his own, who had suffered repeated humiliations from publishers who rejected his manuscripts, who had dreamed of being a recognized writer and had failed in that dream before finding his true power. Heinrich Heine, whose works burned that night, had written in 1820, "There where one burns books, one also burns human beings in the end." The phrase was engraved since 1995 into the ground of Bebelplatz in the exact center of the 1933 bonfire. In the stolen notebook that the Nazis used to record the seized books before the burning, among the confiscated names appeared that of Magnus Hirschfeld, founder of the Institut für Sexualwissenschaft, which was raided and looted on May 6, 4 days before the public burning. The Nazis destroyed its library of more than 20,000 volumes and 12,000 photographs, the most complete research archives on human sexuality existing in the world at that time. Goebbels attended the looting. He approved it. Ernst vom Rath was a 30-year-old German diplomat stationed at the embassy in Paris. On November 7, 1938, Herschel Grinspan, a 17-year-old Polish Jewish youth, entered the embassy and shot him several times. Grinspan had personal motives. His family had been expelled from Germany without prior notice, along with another 16,000 or 17,000 Jews of Polish origin whom Germany had abruptly deported to the Polish border in October, where they remained stranded between the two borders for weeks in miserable conditions. Vom Rath died on November 9th. That date was especially significant for Nazism, anniversary of the Munich Putsch of 1923, the night Hitler had first attempted to take power and had failed, initiating his myth as a man who rises from defeat. The High Party officials had gathered at the Altes Rathaus in Munich for the annual celebration when the news of von Rath's death arrived. Goebbels spoke with Hitler in private. He noted later in his diary, "I explained the situation to the Führer. He decides that the riots continue. Police forces will be withdrawn. The Jews should feel the fury of the people for once." Goebbels returned to the hall and delivered a speech before the party veterans. He did not directly order the attacks, but what he said was clear enough for anyone who heard it. Reprisals were justified. The state would not interpose. Telephone orders from Munich unleashed the riots that same night throughout Germany. What occurred in the following hours is documented by the Holocaust Memorial Museum with chilling precision. More than 1,400 synagogues burned. Approximately 7,500 Jewish businesses destroyed. 91 Jews dead on the night itself, although later estimates raised the number to several hundred when including suicides, deaths in the following days, and those who were deported directly to concentration camps. About 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to Dachau, Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. The next day, Goebbels wrote in his diary, "As expected, the whole nation is in an uproar. This is a dead man that costs the Jews dearly. Our dear Jews will think twice before again striking down German diplomats." Goering, Himmler and other Nazi leaders complained bitterly about the results. Material damage was enormous and difficult to quantify. European insurance companies would refuse to pay for foreign-owned properties destroyed in state-instigated riots, and Germany's international image had suffered a severe blow. The Nazi government resolved the legal dilemma by ordering the Jews themselves to pay a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks for provoking the disturbance of public order. The British ambassador in Berlin, George Ogilvy Forbes, drafted a dispatch to his government in which he described Goebbels as that vile and dissolute demagogue. On February 18, 1943, 10 days after the German army surrendered in Stalingrad, the worst military defeat in the history of the Reich up to that point, with more than 300,000 soldiers lost, Goebbels delivered one of the most studied speeches in the history of demagoguery. The Berlin Sportpalast had a capacity for about 14,000 spectators. It was full. The audience had been carefully selected: war workers, party officials, representatives of the movement's organizations, journalists, all devotees, all willing. Goebbels came onto the stage in his usual dark suit. He began in an almost conversational register and ascended gradually. In the climax of the speech, he asked 10 questions to the crowd, each starting with, "Do you want?" Waltiert in Total and Krieg, "Do you want total war? Do you want, if necessary, a war even more total, even more radical than anything we are capable of imagining today?" And the crowd responded each time with more force. Yes, yes, yes. The speech was broadcast live by radio. Millions of people throughout Germany heard it. For many listeners, it was one of the most powerful moments of the entire war, but there was something that only those who knew the internal mechanism of the event could see. The writer, Sebastian Haffner, analyzing the speech years later, pointed out the artificiality of the construction. The audience had been carefully prepared, the hall had been acoustically optimized for emotional feedback, the questions had been formulated so that they were impossible to answer with a no, without feeling like a traitor. It was not a people expressing its will, it was a machine producing the appearance of popular will. Goebbels himself noted in his diary that day, "It was like a great achievement. The emotion was genuine, that cannot be manufactured, but he had manufactured it." In September 1941, Goebbels returned from a visit to Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg, with a decision agreed upon with Hitler. All Jews in Germany over the age of 6 would have to obligatorily wear a yellow Star of David sewn to their clothing every time they went out onto the street. The measure went into effect on September 5, 1941, but by that date, Goebbels already knew what was happening in the East. In August 1941, he had noted in his diary that in the Baltic states there had been massacres of Jews in the streets. In September, he recorded shootings of Jews in Bessarabia. On October 19th, he noted enormous shootings of Jews in Ukraine. While visiting the Vilna ghetto in November of that year, where thousands of Jews had already been murdered, he wrote that those who remained should be plucked out by the roots. In October and November 1941, the deportations of Jews from Berlin to the east began. The first train left on October 18th for Łódź. Others followed to Minsk, Kaunas, and Riga. Goebbels knew it. He had promoted it actively, pressuring Hitler so that Berlin would be the first city declared free of Jews. On November 16, 1941, Goebbels published in Das Reich the high-circulation weekly that he himself founded and to which he contributed a weekly editorial since its first edition in May 1940, an article titled "The Jews Are Guilty." The text was explicit. It reminded readers of Hitler's prophecy of 1939 that if there was war, the Jews of Europe would be exterminated, and declared, "We are living precisely the execution of that prophecy." The article was read by approximately 1 million people that Sunday and broadcast on radio the following Friday. The historian Jochen Klepper, who lived in Berlin with his Jewish wife and stepdaughter, noted in his own diary that a former army comrade had told him, after reading Goebbels' article in Das Reich, that after Goebbels' great article one could expect nothing else but the extermination of the Jews. On March 27, 1942, Goebbels dictated in his diary, "Starting from Lublin, the Jews are being deported from the general government toward the east. The procedure used is quite barbaric and cannot be described in more detail. Not much remains of the Jews themselves." And, following, the prophecy that the Führer pronounced about them, if they provoked a new world war, is being fulfilled here in the most terrible way. In December 1941, before the Gauleiters gathered in Berlin, Goebbels recorded Hitler's words. "With regard to the Jewish question, the Führer is determined to make a clean sweep. The extermination of the Jews must be the necessary consequence." And Goebbels was not a passive witness of this. He was the man who convinced millions of Germans that it was justified. The difference between the one who executes and the one who provides the moral justification is, for purposes of historical responsibility, non-existent. In the summer of 1936, during the Berlin Olympic Games, while his own ministry presented to the world the tolerant face of Nazism, Goebbels fell in love with a 22-year-old Czech actress named Lida Barova. Barova was a film performer for UFA Studios, recognized in Germany and several European countries. The relationship developed gradually throughout 1937, with meetings at Goebbels' cottage on the shores of Lake Bogensee, about 25 kilometers north of Berlin, which Hitler had given to the Gauleiter of Berlin in 1936. By the autumn of 1938, the relationship was an open secret in party circles and in the foreign press. Magda Goebbels went to Hitler directly with her complaints. Hitler, who felt a special tenderness for Magda and who probably remembered the 1931 crisis in which he himself had been the third party in the discord, intervened with a firmness that left Goebbels humiliated. He ordered him to cut the relationship with Barova. He forbade him to divorce Magda. He told him that he either reconciled with his wife or left all his positions. Goebbels tried to resist. He wrote to Hitler requesting permission to divorce and marry Barova. The response was negative. It was one of the few times in his entire career that Hitler said no to him directly and in terms that admitted no negotiation. According to Goebbels' adjutant, Friedrich Karl von Schaumburg-Lippe, who served at his side for years, Barova was the only woman, apart from Magda, whom Goebbels truly loved. The episode revealed a vulnerability that Goebbels never admitted publicly. His absolute power over millions of Germans did not include power over his private life, which ultimately belonged to Hitler as much as his own. Barova was expelled from Germany. She returned to Czechoslovakia, where the war reached her in other ways. She survived. She was interrogated by Czech authorities after 1945. She died in Salzburg in 2017 at 102 years old. There is something that differentiates Goebbels' archives from any other document of the Third Reich, the scale of its frankness. His diaries are not the work of a man who writes to justify himself before posterity, or at least not only. They are the record of a man who thought aloud, who processed the world through writing, who had made the act of recording his thoughts a substitute for the religious confession that his abandoned Catholicism no longer offered him. In those pages there are entries about the music he heard, the films he saw, the Furtwängler concerts that moved him. There are entries about his children, especially about Helga, the eldest, his favorite, whom he described with repeated warmth over years. There are entries about his conversations with Hitler, recorded with astonishing detail. And there are entries about the extermination of the Jews, written with the same serene prose with which he recorded a premiere at the opera. There is no evidence of moral conflict in those entries, there are no doubts. There are moments of almost aesthetic horror. The procedure is quite barbaric and cannot be described in more detail, which suggests that something in him recognized the enormity of what he was recording. But even that is resolved quickly, and the prose continues. Historian Ian Kershaw, who used Goebbels' diaries extensively for his monumental biography of Hitler, pointed out that the records of conversations between both men are so detailed that in themselves they would justify a new biography of Hitler based only on them. A report prepared for Stalin in 1948 based on the interrogations of two close aides of Hitler was unequivocal. Hitler received him daily and discussed every question with him for hours. Goebbels had an enormous influence over Hitler and in the final weeks of the war enjoyed his unlimited trust. And yet, despite all that intimacy, there is something that Goebbels' diaries never contain: the exact moment in which he and Magda made the irreversible decision about their children. That silence is perhaps the most deafening of all. In 1939, weeks after the invasion of Poland, Goebbels sent the filmmaker Fritz Hippler to Łódź and Warsaw with very specific instructions. He had to film the Polish Jews in their most degraded conditions. He had to record slaughter rituals. He had to produce images that would make the German viewer feel that what they saw was not humanity, but something subhuman. The result was Der ewige Jude, The Eternal Jew, premiered in November 1940. Hitler and his team had forced Polish Jews to kill animals in front of the cameras, to read the Torah for the cameras, and had systematically sought out the most extreme examples of poverty and ugliness to present them as representative of an entire population. Goebbels personally supervised the editing. When he first saw the sequences of ritual slaughter, he wrote in his diary, "This Jewry must be exterminated." It was the first time he used that language in reference to the Jews in his diary. It marked a radical intensification in his own formulations. A few days later, he showed the same sequences to Hitler, who expressed great interest. The film was prepared in two versions, a complete one for party activists and a version with the most extreme slaughter scenes edited out for the general public. Even so, reports from the SD, the Nazi security service, indicated that the public reacted with ambivalence and that in many places the film was withdrawn after barely a week. It did not discourage him. After that relative failure with the general public, Goebbels focused on the film Judd Seuss, 1940, a historical fiction drama about an 18th-century Jewish financier who rapes an Aryan woman and is executed. The film was an enormous popular success in Germany and in the occupied countries. SD reports recorded that in several places in Germany and Hungary, the film provoked open demonstrations against the Jews. The film's director, Veit Harlan, was tried after the war for crimes against humanity. Although he was acquitted, Goebbels was never tried. He made sure of that. There is a disconcerting quality in Goebbels' conduct in the last months of the war that deserves attention. Unlike many of the Nazi leaders who fled, who negotiated in secret, who tried to buy their survival with information or with private capitulations, Goebbels maintained until the last moment a disturbing logical coherence. In August 1943, when the Allies had landed in Sicily, Stalingrad was a recent memory, and the bombings on Hamburg had left more than 40,000 civilian dead in 1 week. Goebbels told his faithful adjutant, Wilfried von Oven, "Either we master this crisis, and I will employ all my powers to that end, or I will bow deeply before the English spirit and shoot myself." It was not rhetoric, it was a precise description of what he would do. In September 1944, when the military situation was already clearly irreversible, Goebbels wrote Hitler an extraordinary letter that he himself dictated in his diary word for word. In it, he admitted that Germany had never won a war on two fronts, that militarily victory was impossible, and that it was necessary to seek a diplomatic solution with the Soviets or with the Westerners. He implicitly asked Hitler to name him Minister of Foreign Affairs, replacing Ribbentrop. Hitler read the letter in silence, put it in his briefcase, and never commented on it. Goebbels waited in vain. In February 1945, with the Soviets already on the Oder River, barely 2 hours from Berlin, Goebbels rejected the idea of evacuating his children. Magda, according to Owen's testimony, had poison for the children, but would not use it until the last moment. Goebbels told the same Owen that the Nazis would be marked forever as monsters and criminals, and that he was not willing for himself, his wife, nor any of his children to live to see our disaster. This phrase, so different from the language of his public speeches, reveals something that his biographers point out with care. Goebbels had a full awareness of what he had done and what it meant. There was no delusion, there was no confusion. There was a dark, crushing logic. They had built a world. That world had failed. No after existed for those who had built it. On April 22, 1945, while Soviet shells fell a few blocks from the Reich Chancellery, Hitler had what Trevor Roper described as his final crisis of rage. He discovered that the plans for a counter-offensive had not materialized. He shouted that everyone had betrayed him. He declared for the first time that the end had come. That afternoon, Goebbels received a telephone call from Hitler. According to the subsequent account of the Soviet intelligence service, based on the interrogations of aides, Hitler asked him in a trembling voice to come to the bunker with his wife and children because everything had ended. 2 automobiles were sent to pick up Magda, the 6 children, and Goebbels from the Ministry of Propaganda. The distance to the Chancellery was short. Magda said goodbye to Owen with a handshake and told him, "We are going to the Reich Chancellery. We all have to poison ourselves." The children entered the bunker in their pajamas. Hitler's secretary, Traudl Junge, described them as cheerful, playing "Happy to be with Uncle Adolf." The eldest, Helga, aged 13, sometimes had a sad and understanding expression in her large brown eyes. In her memoirs, Junge wrote, "She was the quietest, and sometimes I think with horror that in her heart that child understood the pretense of the adults." On April 30th, Hitler and Eva Braun, his wife of less than 40 hours, committed suicide in their rooms. Goebbels and Magda were witnesses when the bodies were carried to the Chancellery garden and burned with gasoline. In his last hours in the bunker, Goebbels dictated an addendum to Hitler's political testament explaining why he disobeyed the order to flee to northern Germany. "For the first time in my life, I must categorically refuse to obey an order from the Führer. My wife and children share this refusal." On May 1st, 1945, at about 5 in the afternoon, Magda took the 6 children dressed in white through the bunker corridor. An aide brought a tray with 6 cups and a jug of chocolate. According to the testimony of telephone operator Rokus Misch, who saw them pass, the chocolate was mixed with sleeping pills. Magda embraced some, stroked others while they drank. Then she led them upstairs. Little Haida, 4 years old, turned around at the end and saw Misch. Laughing, she rubbed one finger against the other in a gesture of affectionate mockery and sang the little game with which she always greeted him. "Misch, Misch, you are a fish." The mother took her gently by the arm and led her upward. Approximately 1 hour later, Magda returned alone. She was crying. She sat at the long table in the conference room and played solitaire. Goebbels went back and forth. According to Misch, he did not see them speak. The 6 children were murdered with cyanide capsules after having been sedated with morphine. Forensic evidence suggests that Helga, the eldest, might have offered resistance. Her jaw was fractured. Shortly after, Goebbels and Magda went up to the Chancellery garden. They bit their own cyanide capsules. An aide, Schwegermann, tried to burn the bodies with gasoline. There was not enough. The bodies did not burn completely. The next day, when Soviet soldiers entered the deserted bunker, they found the bodies of 6 children in bunks. Partially burned outside, in the same room, lay the bodies of a man and a woman. Major Boris Polovoy was among the first to enter. Both bodies had been burned, he declared, and only the face of Joseph Goebbels was still recognizable. On May 1st, 1940, Goebbels met with Hitler and Philipp Bauer, head of Hitler's private chancellery. Bauer informed him about the procedures for liquidation with the insane, which are so necessary and which are now being carried out, still in secret. This is causing many difficulties. Goebbels recorded this without any moral comment. He did not ask what liquidation meant. He did not express reservations. He only noted the existence of the problem with public opinion and continued with the next entry of his diary. The program to which Bühler referred was Action T4, named thus because the coordinating address was at number 4 Tiergartenstrasse in Berlin. Authorized by Hitler in October 1939, the program used carbon monoxide in especially equipped installations to kill patients with mental illnesses, severe physical disabilities, and other conditions that the Nazis qualified as lives unworthy of life. Relatives received letters informing them that the relative had passed away from natural causes. In January 1941, Goebbels noted an additional conversation on the subject. Discuss the question of the silent liquidation of the mentally ill with Bühler. 40,000 have died, 60,000 still must die. That is hard work, but also necessary. And it must be done now. Bühler is the right man for it. By 1941, when public protests began from religious figures such as Bishop Clemens von Galen of Münster, who in a sermon on August 3rd denounced the program in detail and asked if soldiers wounded in combat would suffer the same fate by being useless, Goebbels responded with propaganda precision. He commissioned the production of a film, Ich klage an, I accuse, which presented the killing of terminally ill patients as an act of mercy. The film was seen by more than 15 million spectators in wartime Germany and was, according to historian Michael Burley, notably effective in changing public opinion. The total number of victims of Action T4 is estimated at between 200,000 and 250,000 people in Germany and Austria alone between 1939 and 1941, when the program was officially suspended under pressure from internal opinion. It continued in more decentralized forms until the end of the war. Many of the doctors and technicians trained in T4 were later transferred to the extermination camps in Poland. When the defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 devastated the Eastern Front and destroyed the illusion of German invincibility, Goebbels responded with what many analysts consider his masterpiece of manipulation. The Sport Palace speech of February 18th was followed in the immediate months by a campaign that redefined the language of war for all of German society. But beyond the speech, in July 1944, after the failed July 20th attempt against Hitler, Goebbels was named Bevollmächtigter für den totalen Kriegseinsatz, plenipotentiary for the total war effort. It was the broadest position of civilian coordination he had ever had, above his Ministry of Propaganda. It allowed him to comb the entire German administration looking for men for the front, close theatres and orchestras, including the Berlin Philharmonic, reduce the production of luxury goods and redirect resources to the war machine. Goebbels acted with his usual efficiency. He freed hundreds of thousands of men for military service. He closed 46 orchestras he had designated non-essential, although he preserved several he considered important for morale, including some that continued broadcasting on the radio almost until the end of the war. He ordered the closure of all theatres, dance halls, and non-essential entertainment establishments. And at the same time, barely months from the end, he preserved a list of divinely gifted artists exempt from military service, which included hundreds of names of musicians, actors, and stage directors whom he himself protected. This contradiction was not hypocrisy. It was something more coherent. For Goebbels, German culture was a reason for the war, not just an ornament. The war was fought to preserve the music of Beethoven, the theatre of Schiller, the architecture of Dresden. And when the moment arrived in which even that could not be saved, there was no reason whatsoever to continue living. In December 1941, while the German armies froze before Moscow and the Russian front threatened to collapse, Goebbels travelled to Vienna for the commemoration of the 150th anniversary of Mozart's death. He had to attend the opera, the banquets, the official ceremonies. It was, in his own words, a spiritual martyrdom. The music contrasted with the news arriving from the East. But the day following the official banquet, he heard Furtwängler rehearse Mozart's Requiem with the Vienna Philharmonic and the opera chorus. He wrote in his diary, "A unique musical experience. The effect is immense." And then he forbade the radio broadcast of the concert. Right now we need funeral music that is heroic, but not Christian or certainly not Catholic. This episode captures something crucial about Goebbels that his more superficial critics tend to simplify. He was not indifferent to the culture he claimed to defend. He loved it with genuineness, with a passion that biographer Toby Thacker, reviewing all volumes of the diary, considers incontestable. He loved the music of Beethoven, Schumann, Brahms, Wagner, Bruckner. He attended hundreds of concerts. He had technical opinions on interpretation, on tempo, on orchestral color. His relationship with Furtwängler was complex, precisely because both needed each other and both despised each other to a certain extent. Goebbels needed the conductor to give prestige to the Reich, and Furtwängler needed the protection of the ministry to survive. What makes Goebbels different from ordinary barbarians, and in some way more disturbing, is exactly this. The Holocaust was not designed by men who were ignorant of human culture. It was designed in part by a man who played the piano, who cried with Beethoven, who personally supervised the editing of films, and who noted in his diary which movements of a symphony had moved him. Barbarism does not require ignorance. It only requires that the perimeter of recognized humanity be narrow enough. During his entire adult life, Goebbels published continuously. Weekly articles in Der Angriff since 1927. A regular column in Das Reich since May 1940, which reached a circulation of almost 1.5 million copies. Speeches published in collections. Several books of political chronicles. And the novel Michael. But what most characterized Goebbels' style, what made him different from all other propagandists of the Reich, including the much more prolific Alfred Rosenberg, was that he wrote as he spoke and spoke as he wrote. The same voice. The same nervous syntax of short phrases interspersed with long periods. The same ability to mix philosophical abstraction with concrete anecdote. The apostrophe to the crowd with personal detail. Victor Klemperer, a Jewish philologist who survived Nazism in Dresden thanks to his marriage to a non-Jewish woman, dedicated decades to the study of the language of Nazism, compiled in his work LT1, Lingua Tertii Imperii, the language of the Third Reich. Klemperer observed that Goebbels was the one who with most skill had adapted and coined the neologisms, the set phrases, the euphemisms of the movement. Words like fanaticism turned into virtues, sacrifice into supreme honor, extermination into necessary hygiene. When the American journalist Louis Lochner first heard Goebbels in 1932, he observed something that many other reporters also noticed: the hands. While the voice seemed to tremble with emotion, Goebbels' hands moved with powerful but perfectly controlled gestures. His gestures, although they seemed spontaneous, indicated careful planning because he always adopted the posture for a particular gesture before starting to execute it. The emotion was genuine and manufactured at the same time. It was the result of years of practice, thousands of speeches, hundreds of hours at the radio microphone. In short, he was the best there was. At 3:50 in the morning of May 1st, 1945, General Hans Krebs, Hitler's last chief of staff, arrived at the command post of Soviet General Vasily Zhukov, commander of the 8th Guards Army, to negotiate. He carried with him several documents signed by Goebbels, who at that moment was nominally the Reich Chancellor according to Hitler's testament. Zhukov preserved his account of those negotiations in his memoirs. Krebs, who spoke Russian, arrived with a message from Goebbels that said, "I inform the leader of the Soviet people that today, at 15:30 hours, the Führer voluntarily left this life." And then he asked that the new German government be allowed to meet to negotiate a favorable peace agreement between the two countries. It was, as everyone remaining in the bunker must have known, an impossible request. Stalin had promised unconditional surrender. The Soviets had no incentive to negotiate with anyone in a besieged Berlin, with Hitler dead and the German army in collapse. Zhukov, following superior instructions, demanded unconditional surrender. Krebs returned to the bunker after 12 hours of negotiations without result. What is notable in all this is that Goebbels, who had spent decades convincing millions of Germans that surrender was the worst ignominy imaginable, who had sent to their death tens of thousands of young people from the Volkssturm, convincing them to defend with Panzerfäuste streets they could not defend, who had had deserters shot or hanged in the last months of the war that same Goebbels tried in the final hours to negotiate his political survival. It did not work, and when it became clear it would not work, he was coherent until the end in a way that his victims never were. The house on Dahlema Strasse in Reich, where Goebbels grew up, still stands. It has no plaque. It has no historical mark. People pass in front of it without knowing who lived there during the first 27 years of his life. Berlin's Bebelplatz, where the books burned on the night of May 10th, 1933, today has an underground glass installation designed by the Israeli artist Misha Ullman. If you approach and look down, you see an empty room with white shelves that could hold exactly the books that were burned that night. The memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, with its 2,711 concrete stelae, is built on the site that in part was occupied by the bunker from which Goebbels transmitted his last orders. The reason why the figure of Goebbels continues to be studied with such attention, and the reason why it would be dangerous to conclude this story simply with the image of the corpses in the bunker, is that what he built was not simply a ministry. It was a system, a set of techniques, principles, and mechanisms for mass manipulation that proved to be replicable in very different contexts. The constant repetition of simple messages, the identification of concrete and visible enemies, the use of resentment as political fuel, the appropriation of the emotional language of the community, the presentation of violence as a defensive response, the control of mass communication media to construct alternative realities that seem truer than observable reality. None of these techniques was invented by Goebbels, but no previous practitioner had combined them with such efficiency and on such a devastating scale. In 1933, when the American filmmaker Frank Capra was commissioned by the United States Army to produce a series of explanatory documentaries about the war called Why We Fight, he reviewed German propaganda material and was so disturbed that he wrote that he needed passages from the Bible to understand what he saw. "I had never seen a film that filled me with so much fear," he wrote about Goebbels' propaganda. Capra's response was to make his own documentaries. The response of the Allies was to learn from the adversary enough to fight him. The question that remains open is more uncomfortable. How completely was that lesson learned? Joseph Goebbels died at 47 years old with the sound of Soviet cannons above him, with the bodies of his 6 children on the floor above. He had built a machine that worked for 12 years and that left the world with 50 million dead. His name has become synonymous with organized lies. But what scares most about all this is not the scale of the crime. It is the clarity with which he saw it coming from the beginning, the consistency with which he chose every step that led him to that bunker, and the total absence in 22 years of intimate and burning writing of a single line that suggests he ever wondered if everything could have been different.